And so any word that I say and Sharmila doesn't is a word wasted. So I'll now give over to Sharmila. You should have all the hosting rights and everything, so you can begin.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the generous introduction. I'm excited to talk to you about one of my favorite topics, which is debating feminism. I like feminism. I like debating. It's nice combining them. So I want this to be as interactive as possible. We are covering a lot of ground here today, though. So I think at any point when I am saying something and it is unclear, or you are reminded of something that you want to share, because, that would be nice to include as well. Or if you have a question, or if I'm going too fast, please say so on the chat. Or if I'm suddenly, if I drop out, but I think it should be okay. And I will occasionally monitor the chat and take breaks within sections just to check on you and to see if people are still okay and if people are still following, and answer those questions periodically. We'll also have an opportunity to answer questions at the end. So I'll try to leave like maybe 20-30 minutes at the end for Q&A. But if we can answer some of those within the lecture as well. So don't be shy to ask early. All right, cool. So let's just go through some key terms that you sometimes encounter and the differences between these terms. So as we know, our understanding of gender, our understanding of sex is evolving, right? It's not fixed. We are starting to realize, sex and gender are a lot more fluid than we have realized. It is not really just man, woman. And in fact, uh, there's a growing explosion of work, and not just in the West, but in different parts of the world, that is saying, no, there are different identity configurations. And it's important to be respectful of how people identify. So, what I am going to give you here is a brief overview of the frameworks. Sadly, these are frameworks that are more Western. I encourage you to research the differences that exist among different countries. So, what I'm giving you is not, it's not gospel truth. Please do not treat it as the story begins and ends here. This is just a partial snapshot of where we are right now in our political uh, advocacy, in our understanding. But this is still a very limited understanding. Okay. So some of the key terms you're going to hear. So you will hear the term sex a lot, obviously. This really just means this is assigned to a person on the basis of primary sex characteristics, usually genitalia, right? That's it. That's really all there is to it. And it's not, you've heard, I'm sure, the saying that no one is really born a boy or a girl. They are designated that, right? They are designated male or female. Sometimes people use sex and gender interchangeably, but they shouldn't, right? Now, gender is often expressed in terms of masculinity and femininity. So, masculinity are like, characteristics, behaviors, bodies, representations associated with being a man, femininity with being a woman. Masculinity and femininity have different forms, right? Like, there are certain dominant forms of masculinity and dominant forms of femininity. And this can sometimes change depending on the culture, depending on which point in history, right? Um, this is largely culturally determined. And we kind of assume this from sex at birth. I mean, we shouldn't, and we know that, but it is assumed. It's kind of assumed that, if you're designated female, you will therefore identify as a woman, although as we have realized, that's not necessarily the case. So, gender identity is a person's innate sense of their own gender, whether male, female, or something else, which may or may not correspond to their sex at birth. So, how do you know someone's gender identity? You ask them. They are in a better position to tell you, right? So, you don't assume this of people. Um, Cisgender is a term that people use simply to indicate that their gender identity is the same as the sex they were assigned at birth, right? So if I was designated female at birth, and I identify as a woman, then I am cisgender. Or some people use non-trans. Now, I want to make a few points here about this. Trans is an umbrella term that is used to describe people whose gender is not the same as or does not sit comfortably with the sex they were assigned at birth, right? So you're assigned female, but you do not identify as a woman. Now, some people are like, oh no, but if you use the term cis, you are kind of drawing a line um, between different types of women. And that's problematic because it seems like you're suggesting that, oh, a cis woman is someone who is quote unquote, I hate that term, by the way, natural born, and a trans woman is not. And you're creating a difference when they're all women. You know, I recognize that argument. And so that's why we should be very mindful of our intentions when we use these words, because we don't have perfect terms to describe these concepts or these identities, right? These are imperfect terms. So the reason we use cis sometimes, or at least my reason for using it, is twofold. One, it is to show that being, designated female at birth and being and identifying as a woman is a site of privilege, right? It's the easiest way of being in the world because it's assumed to be natural. It's assumed to it's a dominant way of it's a dominant identity, and that comes with a lot of privilege. So partly by acknowledging it and giving it a name, I am acknowledging my privilege, right? But also by giving it a name, I am showing that it is just one of the many ways that we can be, right? One of the many identities that's possible. Not and so instead of assuming that it is a default identity and therefore not giving it a name anymore because it's a default, I'm also giving it a name to show that, it's also an artificially constructed identity or a socially constructed one. So that's my agenda for using these names. And some people tend to agree with that. That seems to be the dominant um, the dominant understanding. And finally, orientation. So this is to avoid confusion, right? Now, your gender identity and your orientation, your sexual orientation are two different things, right? Your orientation now describes attraction, so either romantic or sexual attraction, or lack thereof, which also happens. And orientations include lesbian, gay, bi, asexual, straight. So that is which identities are you attracted to, or which designated sex are you attracted to. Now, why did I begin with these key terms? They're not actually going to be directly used a lot in the lecture, but I just wanted to give you an overview of these things because a lot of contemporary gender debates require you to have a baseline knowledge of these terms. And you will have access to these slides anyway. Again, if we go into different societies like India or the Philippines or Brazil, these are not necessarily the terms that they would identify with, and we need to be mindful of that, right? These are all imperfect, these are all partial, this is all a work in progress. Okay, now going on to debating feminism more generally, here are some key starting points, because I know that we are trying to absorb a lot of things here, right? Broadly, if someone stopped you on the street and said, give me a definition of feminism now, I think the easiest definition is feminists generally agree that everyone should have equal rights and opportunities. Everyone should have equal rights and opportunities. So it's fairly basic and straightforward, right? That's a definition that we all can agree on. Now, to complicate it a little more, but actually, I say complicate, but at the same time, this actually makes it easier for you in debates and in life. I find it helpful to think of feminism in three ways. So I think of it as all of these three things. One, it's a way of thinking about the world. It's like a lens that you put on. It's like a perspective that you take to the world of understanding the world. And sometimes this is called academic feminism, but it's not just about an academic feminism, right? It's a perspective. Second, so a perspective means it's a set of ideas, a body of knowledge about how we understand and make sense of the world. The second is the more practical stuff. It's an organized political struggle. It's an organized advocacy, right? It's a social movement. It's a collective fight. And then finally, and this is also very important, it's something that people practice in their own lives. And a big slogan of the feminist movement is actually the personal is political, right? Feminists don't just fight on the streets or fight in public spaces, a lot of these fights, a lot of these negotiations, a lot of these dilemmas manifest in our own lives too, because our argument is the patriarchy or sexism, it doesn't just exist out there, it exists too within us, in our minds, in our lives, right? Like, so we need to recognize that. Okay, I am going to pause here for a moment to just do a quick check on you, see how you are. Do we have any questions at this point? Is there chaos and confusion? Okay, I will assume we're still okay. All right, next big point I want to make about feminism before we move on to, discussing the different debates and agreements among feminists. Not all feminists think alike. It doesn't mean, hey, I'm a feminist, you're a feminist. We agree on every single issue, and we agree in the way we, understand specific problems and support certain solutions. We are all committed to equal rights and equal futures for everyone, but our understanding of what the problem is and our understanding of how we can get there varies, right? Again, we don't understand the causes of inequality exactly the same way. We don't always support the same solutions. For example, some feminists would support or at least say that we shouldn't ban pornography and we should reform it, and that there is some transformative potential within pornography or within prostitution, while others are like, never, 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 you must ban. Some feminists will support polygamy, whereas other feminists are like, nope, absolutely not. It is in our interest to promote monogamy or something closer to that. Some feminists, I don't, prefer to work closely with the police and criminal justice systems, and other feminists are like, nope, never. And we will have a conversation about that in a little bit. So feminists kind of disagree on many of these practices and ideas, and debates. Here's the tie back to debating. Debates often require you to defend a perspective, one of these, or to prioritize specific goals or groups over others, right? But that means you want to have a good understanding of all of these perspectives. Now, here, some difficult questions, right? These are difficult questions that you will encounter in debates, but these are also difficult questions within the feminist movement itself that we struggle with and that we ask ourselves. Do women share the same identity just by virtue of being women? Just by virtue of the fact that you were born and then doctors decided to say that you are female on the basis of some body parts, do you then share an identity with everyone who has been designated female? I mean, think about your first world female corporate executive, right? Think about Sheryl Sandberg, who is the COO of Facebook, Harvard, Yale education. Think about Marissa Myers, who's like CEO of Yahoo. I know all these high-powered women. Priti Patel in the UK, who's the Home Secretary, who is trying to get all the immigrants deported. Like, what do they share in common with female domestic workers from South Asia or Southeast Asia? Do they really have stuff in common beyond certain body parts, right? Or Black women and their relationship with the police. So if you look at the legislation on domestic violence or, rape or sexual assault, a lot of feminist campaigning and lobbying in the US, in the UK, which initially had middle-class white women at the forefront, campaigned very strongly for solutions that involved police surveillance, police patrolling, criminal justice system, right? Suing people, putting people in jail, arrests, monitoring, all of that. But then if you talk to women from ethnic minority groups, and I don't want to make generalizations, but like, let's say Black feminism, for example, a big component of Black feminism in the US is resistance to carceral solutions. So a carceral approach basically just means an approach to social problems that highlights the role of the criminal justice system and has a prominent role for the police. So for these women, they're like, no, we don't actually think that the solutions to these problems of women's security and women's safety should be heavily driven by the police, because the police is a big source of our insecurity. Why are you making them our rescuers and our saviors when they are a big part of the threat in the first place, especially against, non-white individuals, right? Um, and so Black women have a very different experience with the police, a different history with them. There is a lot of police violence against Black women, which we just don't talk about because there's a lot of focus on Black men, which obviously that's important. But actually, the numbers of Black women who are incarcerated or who are abused by the police are quite high too, right? And so they're like, look, these are the people who are murdering our husbands and our fathers and us too. If there's a domestic violence problem, and there is, right? Because violence against women is a problem even in the Black community, they're like, we understand that it's a problem, but we're not sure that the solution is to call the cops. We're not sure what that solves. Because what's likely to happen is we'll just all end up dead, right? So you need, I mean, I don't know how old you are here because I can't see people, but we need to understand how threats are constructed or how threats are understood. So when I was younger, there was this video that went viral that was released by Hollaback Girl, I think, or Hollaback, sorry. That Hollaback Girl is a song, oh my God. Hollaback, like a site that is like a feminist and edgy, you know, internet site where they shot a video of a woman walking through the streets and getting catcalled, right? Like getting, getting propositioned, getting complimented, getting asked to smile, people talking about her body parts, making her really uncomfortable. So it was a campaign against street harassment, and obviously that's an important campaign because street harassment is disrespectful. It makes women insecure in public spaces. It seems to suggest that men are safer in public spaces than women. Fine, fair enough. But what happened in this video is it was a white woman walking down the street, and then people realized when they reviewed the footage and they reviewed what was edited out that what happened was it was a white woman walking down the street, and the catcallers were always men who were men of color, so Latinos or Black men or South Asian men. And whenever it was a white man who was catcalling, they edited it out. Whether this is intentional or not, the narrative that is then created here is the white woman who is vulnerable and under threat, and then brown men or Black men are savages who are threatening the white woman, right? Where's the Black woman here? And also, where are white men here? It's very problematic. So some people would say that the kind of entitlement that white women have, this idea that they're always victims, that they need to be protected, that's not how we tend to view Black women. Black women are seen as threats, are seen as not worthy of violence, especially by quote unquote the establishment. So then, do they share the same identity? Are their struggles the same? I don't know the answer to that question. So many different thinkers have different perspectives on this. I'm not even going to talk about Taylor Swift anymore. I like her in her later years. But obviously, some feminists will tell you things are easier for her than others because white, wealthy. Although then some people will say, yeah, but she is using her privilege to advocate for those who don't have privilege. Fair enough, right? So women exist in different contexts in terms of their access to reproductive rights, their access to employment, their burdens of care, um, unpaid too, and the restrictions on their speech and how they can dress. So we need to understand those different contexts when we are proposing solutions or we're trying to diagnose what the problem is, right? So the point I'm trying to make here is gender intersects with race, class, religion. And when I say intersect, I don't mean that this is a mathematical formula of 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 3. The way these things become indistinguishable from each other. And this is my example of Black women, right? Like the way we understand femininity for white women because of the interaction of race, class, and gender is very different from the way we understand femininity for Black women. Why is one group perceived as vulnerable and deserving of protection, and why is another group perceived as threatening, right? that's not something that you can address with 1 + 1 + 1 = 3. The way these factors intersect is so indistinguishable from each other, right? So now that I've explained, that it's very different, then you ask yourself, do all women share something in common by virtue of being women? Is there even a point for using the identity of woman for political advocacy, for fighting for rights, if we're also so different from each other? I don't know. Some people will say yes, and some people will say no, and that's part of the debate. And I want to leave you to think about that on your own instead of telling you what to think. All right. Again, I recognize that that's a lot. Let's again do a temperature check. How are people so far? Any questions? Okay, cool. I will assume people are still okay. All right, in this next section, what we are going to do is we will identify the different perspectives, I suppose, in feminism. But I want to give you a few caveats, like any debater would. These perspectives, even if when I am presenting them to you, they seem like they are, different categories, different types, they're not always that different from each other in practice, right? So why am I presenting them to you this way? This is the most effective way in 1 hour to show you what the key differences are, but also the key conversations are between them, right? But in practice, the distinction is not always that neat. In fact, when we when we have debates about specific issues or even ethical dilemmas in our own lives, we tend to borrow from all of these schools of thought, and apply them together, and that's a better way of doing it, rather than saying, I am going to approach this debate entirely as a liberal feminist. That's kind of silly, right? And all of them have something to offer us. And the best type of feminism is one that draws on the strengths of each one, right? But again, I'm presenting it this way to help you appreciate what these debates are. But don't, don't overstate the differences. All right. So let's talk about liberal feminists first. So the first strain of feminist thought. When we say liberal, there's a lot of emphasis on individual freedom, right? And there's a lot of emphasis on the public sphere. Because it is in a way kind of inherited from liberalism, political liberalism, so the Enlightenment ideologies that were, surprise, surprise, mostly led by or mostly conceived of by men, right? So there's a lot of emphasis on the individual. And later on, we'll see why that is a bit problematic. So the way liberal feminists will diagnose the problem is they will say women's oppression is rooted in legal and political constraints in the public sphere, right? It is because of a result of an unequal playing field in the public sphere. So the fact that at one point women were denied the right to vote, or denied the right to own property, or denied the right to run for office, or denied the right to go to school. So these are the constraints that lead to inequality for the liberal feminists. And therefore, we are going to remove those formal barriers. We are going to remove those constraints. So the agenda usually of liberal feminists is to call for changes in political procedures and practices, and to call for women's access to credit, women's involvement in the labor force, right? But then the argument is, after we have formally dismantled all of these, constraints, then it's up to the individual to choose what they want. So if it is already allowed for women to work, if it's already allowed for women to go to school, if women are already allowed to run for office, the fact that you don't have many women winning elections, or the fact that many women are not in the labor force, is no longer a matter of politics. It's now a matter of personal choice. I mean, we give them a choice and they have chosen not to make use of these opportunities. So that tends to be the justification, right? I mean, obviously within liberal feminism, it's already evolving. That has also been challenged. I'm kind of showing you as much of it as I can capture. And so a relevant example here would be, okay, women have no access to credit. because credit means like money, right? From traditional banks or traditional lending institutions, because they usually don't have property, so they have no collateral to borrow against. Sometimes they don't even have identity documents, so they are disadvantaged because, you know, in this mindset, the best way for empowerment is economic empowerment also, right? Like being able to engage with the market, being able to have access to capital to invest and to roll, and to generate income from that. And so, let us give women access to credit then, microcredit, right? Almost exclusively targeted at women in some places. Or, all right, fine, let's give affirmative action for women in parliament, which already within liberal feminists, that's already debatable, because some people are like, oh no, but that's more than equality. Some are like, no, 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 that's equality, fine. All right, we reserve a certain number of seats in office for women. Now, please remind me later. That's where liberal feminists are, right? Or in terms of the military, for example, liberal feminists are going to say, hey, we can make the military a more equal institution by having more women there. We can show the world that what men can do, women can also do, and sometimes they can even do it better. So that's the path to equality, more women soldiers, right? All right, let's go on to the next feminists. Um, Socialist feminists have a slightly more, I guess we can say, a more radical take on things, right? But don't confuse them with the radical feminists. So they're like, I am not quite. Liberal feminists, you're not going far enough, right? For them, you know, it's not enough to have women in the boards of companies. It's not enough to have women presidents. I mean, what's the point if in the end those same women still do harmful things? They're like, do you want us to be thankful that it is a woman pushing the button in war rather than a man? Do you want us to be thankful that it's a woman that is firing employees in the middle of a pandemic than a man? That's not the kind of empowerment we want. We don't want women to have the same powers that men have now. We want a more equal society. Fair, right? And so they're like, so that's one thing they say. Second, they say women's oppression is a product of capitalistic, political, and economic structures, right? At the moment, it is predominantly men who control the means of production economically. Most of the world's wealth, although that is slightly changing, is controlled by men. And if you control wealth, you control the production of ideology in many ways. Like, just think about it, for example, in terms of ownership of media institutions, ownership of education institutions, but also the connection between economic wealth and political power. You can fund politicians, you can run as a politician, which then means your ability to shape ideas, shape the law, right? Um, which is essential in production of ideology, is therefore controlled by men. And that's a problem. We need to change that. But to them, the solution isn't to replace the men with women, but for a more, because then that reproduces the problem, but to replace this power structure that we have, to have more economic redistribution, to focus on economic justice, right? So they also talk about things like how the market itself is gendered, right? How women do a lot of unpaid work to sustain the capitalist system as we know it, but they don't get credit for that unpaid work. So they're like, look, companies are extracting labor from their workers. They're extracting a lot of value from their workers. They take everything they can, right? And they barely compensate these workers. So when your worker, stereotypically male worker, comes home, there is usually a woman, a mother, or a partner who prepares their food, provides care for them and the children, the maintenance of social reproduction, right? That is essential to sustaining them, that is essential to their productivity. So effectively, it is women's labor that is free labor that is subsidizing this capitalist system, right? And it's kind of just expected that they would do it. And the distinctions we make between what we pay for, what we consider productive, is heavily gendered. Think about how you measure global domestic product or global national GDP, GNP, right? Like, think of how we measure productivity. We look at what people buy and sell, what people consume officially. I mean, the most basic example here is someone buys an egg. What is recorded there? The fact that it was bought, that it was consumed, right? What is invisible there? The fact that that might have been a woman who walked to the store, purchased it, walked back home, cooked it, served it to people. None of that is recorded as productive. Women don't get credit for any of that, right? So the fact that it's not captured in the way we conceive of the economy, the way we, this is my problem with economists, right? They think they have a perfect discipline. They think they have, they have quantified human economic transactions. No, they haven't. They've been ignoring all of women's contributions here, and by ignoring it, you kind of signal to the world and to women themselves that their contributions are not valuable. But childcare is freaking valuable, right? You're not going to have a future workforce if you didn't have women like raising those children, or giving up their own like personal freedom sometimes and their own careers in order for that to happen. So that's the critique. So a lot of informal work is performed by women. Part of the reason that happens is because women are discriminated against in the formal labor sphere, or don't have time for it because of all these other informal burdens of care that they have to face, that we are not giving them credit for, that we are not even bothering to like quantify, right, or measure the value of. So within socialist feminism, there is also like some debate there, right? So socialist feminists prefer to work alongside um, men and other groups too, so not just women, because they recognize that, again, remember, if power inequality is a result of inequality in capital, in access to capital, so they're like, well, some men are also screwed over. So it's not like we want to work with all women, because some women are part of the problem. The more elite women are part of the problem, and so we would rather work with disprivileged men as well, to change this structure, right? To change this larger pattern of capitalist exploitation. Great. I think that's important. I kind of believe that as well. I do think that it's not just women who are screwed over by the capitalist system, because some women are winners in this system. At the same time, one criticism of socialist feminists is that sometimes they forget the women then, because they are so focused on destroying the capitalist system. Sometimes the more women specific dimension of it is kind of neglected. So what is prioritized is the male worker. And sometimes people forget things like women's reproductive and sexual rights, or the right of women. So it kind of reproduces the fact that women have to perform this free labor for the revolution. And you've heard this argument so many times, right? When women participate in revolutionary movements, women participate in protests and all of that, but then they're told, women's rights can wait. Let's first overthrow the existing, powers, and then we will have women's rights after. But that after never happens, right? So later is the time zone of the patriarchy, as Cynthia Enloe quote, right? So this is a problem. Next, radical feminism. All right. As you can guess, my feelings about this. So radical feminism identifies certain traits as predominantly female. So things like community, connection, capacity for caring. So these are seen as predominantly female, the opposites of traits that are identified as predominantly male, such as individualism, aggression, assertiveness, rationality, lack of emotion. Obviously, that's kind of silly because, we've seen that example debunked throughout history. This supposed idea that men don't start drama. Hello, Donald Trump. Hello, so many men throughout history who are like deeply emotional. But whatever, let's pretend. Let's pretend that men are not, right? Now, according to radical feminists, the world has this binary way of looking at masculinity and femininity. That's fair. And we tend to assume that women are more emotional, irrational, incapable of making difficult decisions, and men are like strong, capable of leadership, right? Whether true or not. And sometimes, so the radical feminists don't agree on this. Some of them think these differences are essential, they're biological, they're inherent. Some of them think that it is a matter of socialization over time, but because, there is so much deep, it's almost culturally deep seated, it's almost sedimented, like, it almost became and it's practically entrenched because of lots of reinforcement and socialization over time. So they're like, look, some traits are associated with femininity, some traits are associated with masculinity. The problem is we overly value as superior the traits that are associated with masculinity, right? We idealize them, and then we think of women's traits, quote unquote, as inferior. So therefore, we can fix this problem by reshaping cultural norms. We can fix this problem by telling people that the more feminine values are not bad. In fact, they're good. In fact, these are the values we should adopt. In fact, we should, reduce the emphasis on individualism. We should reduce the emphasis on violence and aggression. We should emphasize caring. We should emphasize community and connection. We should, we should rethink the justice system. And instead of the emphasis on retribution and punishment, we should shift the emphasis to community, to connection, to rehabilitation, to support. Why do we have to play the game of men, right? So, um, in terms of the debate on militarism, like I said to you earlier, the liberal position is, oh, the problem is we don't have enough women in the military. Well, then we add women. We beat men at their own game. We show that women can do it too. And radical feminists are like, no, the military as an institution is problematic. It entrenches violence, it entrenches colonialism. It promotes the idea that physical strength is um, the most important standard, right? It's racist, it's sexist. You're not going to change that if you join it. You will just become one of them, right? What does it take to succeed in the military? It means succeeding by their own standards, by the rules of the game that they have set, and you're not going to change the rules by joining it and trying to succeed within that ecosystem. So this is not a feminist victory. This is a co-optation. So that's what the radical feminists will say to the liberal feminists. So they will say, don't argue for women to be included in the draft. Argue to abolish the draft, right? Um, Likewise for affirmative action, like women in corporate boards, for example, they will say, socialist feminist is going to say, women in corporate boards doesn't fix anything because it helps the elite women, but it doesn't help the women who need this the most, the middle management women, or the women in more precarious occupations. You're not going to help the immigrant cleaner by putting a white woman in the corporate board, because that white woman is never going to fight for your immigrant cleaners, right? So is this really a feminist victory for socialist feminists? In fact, it is a co-optation for them, and radical feminists are probably inclined to say the same thing. But for radical feminists, though, if you institute enough women at all levels of management, then for them, it might be a way of reshaping the norms of the institution. I don't think they will say this about the military. They might say it about corporations. So Sheryl Sandberg, for example, wrote a book called Lean In. I hate it. I don't know if you've read this book. In this book, I mean, she admits that her audience is mostly privileged women. But in this book, the argument is, oh, part of the reason women don't succeed in the corporate world, but also, like, I think she makes broader claims about leadership in life. Part of the reason women don't succeed is because they uh, internalize their inferiority. So they don't lean in enough. They second guess themselves. I'm sure you've heard the expression, walk in there with the confidence of a mediocre white man. So that's basically what she says. She's like, look, we're not confident in ourselves. We don't push ourselves enough. We don't advocate for ourselves enough. So you must lean in. You must assert yourself in meetings. You must take credit for your ideas. When you are negotiating for better pay or better working conditions, don't settle for less. Men don't settle for less, so women shouldn't settle for less. Now, the reason I am uncomfortable with this kind of rhetoric is, one, it sounds to me a little bit victim blamey, which is like, okay, so now it is kind of women's fault that they did not like fight harder. But how accessible is this strategy for women? Maybe some women have more leverage than others, and they have a good fallback position. If you assert yourself and then it blows up and backfires, you have somewhere else to go after. Or maybe you are really, really valued because of your pedigree, then you can afford to do this. But not all women have that. And for some women, the costs of doing that are too high, right? That's one. Two, in a way, to me, it kind of sounds like we're asking women to adopt very masculine rules of the game in order to succeed, instead of problematizing those masculine rules and saying, but that's not how it should be, right? We shouldn't be living in a very dog eat dog world. We should, in fact, be investing in processes that make corporate culture less toxic and more inclusive in the first place, right? To be honest, the correct answer is probably somewhere in between, and it will probably depend on what specific policies. But I am very wary of women adopting masculine strategies in order to succeed, because A, that's not available to everyone. And also, I'm not sure that we end up with a better world as a result of that. All right, I see someone on the chat. Olivia has a question. Yes.
Yeah, some feminists believe that people who transitioned to being women shouldn't really be considered as women. What string would that fall into?
I am about to discuss postmodern feminism. But actually, correct Olivia for asking that now. This is why I rolled my eyes when I went to the radical feminist box. So radical feminism, I want to make clear, is a very wide category. So not all radical feminists think in the same way. So within every category, there are little debates too. But there is I'm choosing my words very carefully. There is a strain of radical feminists, a group, a subset of radical feminists who indeed want to police, to safeguard the boundaries of the category woman, right? And the way we conceive of women's bodies. So these radical feminists are like, there is something inherent about being born in a certain kind of body that makes you a woman, and that experience is not shared by everyone, even if someone identifies as a woman. Um, but they were not born with this body. There's something that they cannot fully understand about being a woman, the experience of violence that women have experienced by being in this body since birth. I want to make very clear that I think this is a problematic argument, immensely problematic argument. I do not agree with it, but I it is my duty to expose you to all of these schools of thought. And you also see within this subset an insistence on women only spaces. Now, I have no problem with women only spaces, because I see the argument for a space for women to be together, because the importance of women only spaces is a lot of times when women have to share space with men, women don't get a platform. Women don't always feel safe to articulate their ideas. They are belittled, they are dismissed, they are talked over and interrupted. Men tend to set the agenda. I understand the importance of women only spaces, but I think trans women deserve to be in those spaces. Now, the debate on women only spaces is less about should we have them or not, but for some of these radical feminists, they don't want trans women to be included in those women only spaces. And I do have a problem with that. But their argument is, oh, what if I'm a woman? Trigger warning. Ooh, what if I have experienced, sexual assault or violence by male-bodied individuals, and then you are now expecting me to share my safe space with these trans individuals? I don't feel safe around them because of bodies. To which my answer is, trans individuals are among the biggest targets of violence in this world, like more than cis women sometimes, precisely because they are breaking boundaries and doing things that are seen as unacceptable. And so I am not sure why we wouldn't share space with them, because the same, men that you are angry about are also committing violence against trans women, so I'm not sure why we would exclude them, right? But anyway, like that's a debate. And so when we go to postmodern feminism, we'll have a chat about that as well. But the trans exclusion, especially in the UK, is quite a problem. And then these radical feminists are also saying, oh, if we are trying to say that gender norms don't matter, if we're trying to fight against gender norms, our problem with trans women is they're saying that you need to be in a certain body to be able to conform to your gender, and that's problematic. And I'm like, sure, but you are also the ones policing the boundaries of who can be a woman or not. So you're also falling into the same trap, if not far worse, right? So yeah, a lot of the arguments against trans inclusion would come from a subset of radical feminists. Likewise for sex work and prostitution. Just a disclaimer that my PhD dissertation was on sex work, and I think sex work is work, and I think that it's not real feminism unless you include sex workers. But within a subset of radical feminism, again, they think that, so the premise is men tend to control women's bodies, right? And because they believe in femininity and masculinity, they say that femininity and masculinity is the way people understand the world. That might not be untrue, actually. That might be true. But according to them, historically, masculinity was expressed through the sexual domination of women. And femininity was expressed or was embodied by being sexually submissive and sexually dominated. Maybe. And so their argument is, if that is the case, then things like sex work and pornography are always going to be oppressive, because it would be a way of men to enact dominant masculinity and for women to therefore enact like submissive femininity. Maybe. I mean, my answer here is it's complicated for many reasons. One, sex work, while it is feminized right now, so is domestic work, so is some forms of factory work in export processing zones, so is sewing and knitting and handicrafts and baking and hairdressing and rags and and sewing rags. Those are also feminized forms of work. So we allow those things. I'm not sure why we don't allow sex work, in a way that we are forcing sex workers into those jobs instead, which are also feminized but pay less by the hour and are less flexible because they require you to report to a male employer, as opposed to you being able to, if it is legal, control the terms of your own work. So I'm confused about what the feminist agenda is. Also, even if we believe that historically sexual relations were very unequal, does it always have to be that way? Where is the potential for transformation? Because in practices like sex work and porn, at least if you ask me, not all of, obviously I don't want to romanticize them, right? Like some of them are genuinely oppressive. But if we stop stigmatizing it, and if we actually give sex workers power over their working conditions instead of trying to catch them all the time, wouldn't we actually provide a space for that potential transformation to happen? Does it always have to be submission? Because I don't think so. Because my concern with the radical feminist approach here is, where's the space for transformation? Does this mean then marriage too, and any amount of any type of heterosexual sex is therefore always and forever doomed to be oppressive? I don't want that kind of future, right? And in fact, you will meet again a small subset of radical feminists who don't think that heterosexual sex can ever be equal under whatever situation, right? And so there's this whole like, the only path to freedom is to be a lesbian, which again I find a bit ridiculous, but sure, that is a thing you must be exposed to. All right, next. Postmodern feminists. So these ones, they reject unitary or binary understandings of the world, including gender, right? They're like, hang on, pause. Let us not assume that the sex you are born with is natural. That is something that we impose on the babies. Babies are born as babies. It is us who decide, on the basis of certain body parts, you are boy, you are girl. Why have you chosen those body parts? It's not clear. Why don't you classify them based on something else? It's unclear. Why do you even have to classify them in the first place? It's unclear. And in fact, more and more critical biologists are starting to look at it and say, actually, beyond the genitalia, and you have intersex, right? Which kind of shows you that these classifications are unstable. You have intersex individuals. You also have people who are studying chromosomes now, and they're realizing that people, so I'm not a scientist, I don't want to misrepresent the argument, but read up on this, that people's chromosomal formations or composition do not necessarily conform to their designated sex. And that genitalia is just one manifestation, but there are many other manifestations that don't necessarily conform to boy or girl, but we have overly simplified it into boy or girl, right? And this is in some ways quite a Western construct, because, and colonialism kind of exported it to different parts of the world. Because if you look at different communities, they have very different conceptions of gender arrangements, right? So the argument of postmodern feminists is, look, it was not always like this from the beginning of time. This is no way natural. This is not inherently that way. We are choosing to classify people this way. So actually, we have a gender dimension of the world, masculine, feminine. It is actually gender that determines sex, not the other way around. Not your sex that determines your gender. Actually, gender came before sex, is kind of what they're saying. But because you have been sexed, right? Because your sex has been designated, then you then have this like weird expectation to perform gender in a certain ways. And that is performatively created. It's like something you repeat and you practice, the way you structure your body, the way you behave, the certain behaviors that are considered acceptable, that you repeat again and again and again over time, then it becomes natural to you. Now, obviously, this argument has been misrepresented. It's not saying that, you know, if you identify as a woman, that's fake, that's superficial, that's a lie. Of course not. I do identify as a woman in a way that is almost natural. But what it's trying to say is the fact that it feels almost natural is a result of constant repetition and constant reinforcement over time. But is it actually natural in an absolute sense? No. I did not choose to be sexed female, right? And so for them, that's oppressive, because lucky you if your gender identity conforms to what you were designated at birth, right? And lucky you again if your gender performance kind of conforms with how we conceive of masculinity and femininity. But that's not true for many people. And so, what's the point of maintaining this very rigid heterosexual framework? Why do we do this to ourselves? Why don't we just recognize that identity is fluid and like free people, right? So for them, the political agenda is we denaturalize these sex roles. They were not natural in the first place, but they were stabilized over time because of all these practices, right? Because of law, because of medicine, because of our own participation in it. Why don't we just take a step back and destabilize them, right? And say you're free to be what you want to be. Radical feminists have a problem with this. I think it's great. So anyway, post-colonial approaches. So some feminists from non-Western societies say, you know, sometimes feminism as an agenda has been co-opted by Western imperialism and Western imperialist logics. So there are many ways in which this happens. One, even the categories that we use, right? LGBT, cis women, cis men, the terms that we use don't necessarily correspond to how gender identities play out in other societies. That's not how they conceive of these things. Or even your conception of gay, there are some like very Western forms of behavior that would be classed as gay, but that someone who doesn't identify as heterosexual man in different societies would not really, you know, consider as an accurate reflection of how they identify as gay, for example. I don't want to get into super detail here because we're also running out of time, but I encourage you to do your own research. The more concrete examples would be femo-nationalism and homo-nationalism. So you were too young to remember, but when the US invaded Afghanistan or even Iraq, some of the arguments they were making were, we need to free the women in these societies from the men who are oppressing them. Cool story. Are the women in these societies actually better off as a result? No. But then women's rights kind of becomes used as an excuse to justify militarized intervention into other societies, or to suggest somehow that Western society is superior to these other societies. I mean, if you look at domestic violence in the US, if you look at the regressions of women's rights in the US, I'm not sure that they are better off, but this is a common argument that you hear all the time. Also, militarism is bad for women too in those countries. War leads to a lot of sexual violence against women, leads to economic displacement. If the men in the family are killed, that increases the burdens of women. How are you really upholding women's rights with war is unclear to me. But you hear women's rights being used to justify Western imperialist projects, right? Same with homo nationalism also. So this perception that, oh, because we somehow are more tolerant towards homosexual rights, we are superior societies. And you see that being used by Western societies all the time against immigrants and all of that. But I am not, again, sure that I 100% believe this. You've heard the argument pinkwashing, I guess, where Israel like projects to the entire world this image of itself as being very safe for LGBT individuals. Maybe Tel Aviv, but to be honest, not the rest of Israel, right? But like, look at us, we are great. In the Middle East, we are the only country that's tolerant of homosexuals. Sure, but they're also occupying Palestine. So using quote unquote progressive gender politics to actually sanitize, kind of like money launder, to kind of launder other abuses that are being committed, right? So between, obviously, post-colonial feminists like myself, we are caught between a rock and a hard place, because while we hate Western imperialism and we hate the cooptation of feminism in the name of Western imperialist interests, it's not like we love our own politics or our own brand of nationalism, because we also have our little local tyrants. And in fact, our local tyrants are using Western imperialism as the enemy to create space for them to be locally oppressive. Duterte in the Philippines will say, you know, I hate women's rights, or I hate a Western brand of women's rights. Let's not listen to the West. The West is our enemy. They are telling us how to think. And then he will crack rape jokes. And I'm like, yeah, okay. The West is indeed instrumentalizing women's rights for their own political goals. But at the same time, you are trying to discredit them so that they cannot criticize your violent war on drugs in which you are killing so many people. I also don't like that. So it kind of sucks, because then you have no friends, right? It's the same as the burqa debate. A lot of Western feminists are like, oh, we must save these poor Muslim women from the burqa because they're being forced to wear it. It's true, some of them are forced, some of them are not. But if you suddenly ban the burqa, are you actually making things better for them? No, you're not. You're just using women's bodies as a battlefield for Western ideology, Western power over the power then of like local, Islamic, I guess, men ideologies. And if you tell parents that that their daughter now can no longer wear the burqa, what do you think is going to happen? Do you think they will say, okay, noted, thank you, we will now allow our daughter to go in public and go to school and just roam freely? No, it's likely to be, okay, then if you're going to tell me that she cannot wear the burqa in public, I'm going to force her to wear it in school. I will fight the teachers. I'll pull her out of school. I will not allow her to go to her friend's house. I'm not going to allow her to like hang out in public anymore. So I'm not sure that the women are winning here, right? Who are the people you're trying to help, and are you actually really helping them? Is not clear. Anyway, cool. Very briefly here before I open up for questions, because we just have 25 minutes left. So some common debates when you encounter motions, always ask yourself first, how is the problem defined, right? Because how you understand how the problem is defined will then affect the solutions you support or you reject. Now, usually in debates, you have the solution and you have to defend the solution. So the way I usually describe this is, in real life, you first try to understand the problem and then you find the solution. In debate land, sadly, you have the solution. You need to find a problem to match the solution, right? So you have to characterize the problem in a way that fits the solution that you are defending. So if, let's say, you are trying to say you want to reject cosmetic surgery or ban cosmetic surgery, what's the problem there? The problem is, fine, we exist in a patriarchal world where there are certain conceptions of beauty that are racist and also very sexist, right? Uh, Western standards of beauty, whiteness, fairness, high bridged noses, um, but also, and like wide open eyes as opposed to like all of that, um, and also thinness and all of that, and straight hair. So these are sexist and these are racist. And cosmetic surgery is a vehicle for realizing those things. That is how you conceive of the problem on pro. On op, you agree that patriarchy exists because you can't lie and say, no, it doesn't. We're all free. Both of you have patriarchy on your side, right? Who is making it less harmful? On prop, you say you are making it less harmful because cosmetic surgery is one way by which patriarchal and sexist expectations are institutionalized and imposed. It's a new vehicle, right? Because now people are like, you have a way to change how you look anyway. Why haven't you done it? And it's a collective action problem, which makes it a false choice, right? It's an illusion of choice. Liberal feminists will tell you it's a choice, it's a choice, it's a choice. They're like, no, 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 illusion of choice. Because while you arrive at the decision individually, how individual and informed is that decision really? Because it's coerced out of you, right? If more and more women opt into this, it becomes harder for you to opt out of it because it becomes the norm. It becomes the baseline expectation. Because people are now like, well, if she can do it, why can't you? Right? And then as more and more uh, people opt into this, the price of resisting becomes higher. That's what collective action means, right? You resisting absorb all the cost. Other people absorb the benefit if you succeed, but they did not absorb the cost. So why are you going to try, right? So how real is that choice then? It gives you the illusion of choice, but that's not a real choice, which makes it even worse. On the opposition, you do your moves are different. You're like, okay, good that you have conceded that patriarchy exists. It will exist regardless of whether you allow this or not. But when that happens, um, when that happens, you are making things worse because patriarchy does exist. All of these expectations of attractiveness do exist. But what you are doing is you're forcing people to make peace with how they were born, their looks when they were born, which is not something that is within their control. It's birth lottery. It's also not something that's fair, right? So you will still have privilege on your side. But what's worse is you will not have a way of equalizing that privilege or reducing the gap between certain people as much as possible. We're not going to beat patriarchy on either side, but at least on our side, because we know that certain, you know, some people might think that certain appearances are more valued than others. You give individuals the ability to decide for themselves how much that is harming them or hurting them, or how much, you know, to pick their own battles. And if they want to decide to change how they look in order to gain more confidence so that they can pursue more transformative goals in other directions, they should be allowed to do that. Like, we shouldn't be forcing upon women to, you know, fight the patriarchy on their own. You're turning them into instruments, right? Like, and saying, no, 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 you must absorb all these sacrifices in order for institutional change to happen later on. That is unfair, especially to people who um, do not conform to these like mainstream notions of attractiveness. Like, they, if you're worried about cost, then you are putting a disproportionate cost on them again because of your like political agenda to change the world, right? So that is your conception of the problem on the other side. A huge part of feminist disagreements is the debate on choice and whether it is possible to find liberation within a capitalist framework. So you see that in debates on microcredit, for example, where some people are like, you're targeting microcredit exclusively at women. The argument in favor of it is more access to credit means women can now start small businesses and earn an income from that, which therefore means that if they are in an abusive relationship, it becomes easier for them to leave, or their bargaining power in the household is increased because they have access to more income, which means it becomes easier for them to dictate how the money is spent, or to spend some money for their own personal needs. And so that is a form of empowerment. Women, they're seen as more productive, there's more respect. Also, easier for women to collectivize, because usually microcredit happens in the context of group lending schemes, right? So women meet each other regularly. Not only do they talk about their businesses, but sooner or later they also have conversations about rights and leadership within the community. The opposition to that is, are you mad? Like, first, you have just increased women's working hours, because now not only do they still have a lot of the domestic and reproductive burdens, you're telling them that in order to be productive, they must do all of these labor intensive jobs too. Because the credit is low, the kind of jobs that they can work on are labor intensive jobs like hairdressing, selling fish in the market, sewing, baking, right? So you massively increase their working hours for very insecure jobs. And also, how many hairdressers can you really have in one community? So these jobs are not even stable. It's quite likely that many of them will fail. Plus, poor women, what makes you think they're great entrepreneurs? And I don't mean to be insulting here. I mean, if you ask me to start a business, it will fail. So why are we expecting suddenly the burden on poor women to be great entrepreneurs? And then if it fails, it's their fault, and they have to pay for those debts. Also, microcredit, because now we have this idea that we have given them some help, it reduces the support for welfare. Because now, instead of providing people education, healthcare, cash transfers, we reduce the political capital for those solutions, because all of that is transferred into microcredit. Why don't we just make them business women? And then that way, the state and the NGOs and the microcredit institutions also win, because the women are still paying back interest on those loans, right? But why have we replaced poverty alleviation with a capitalistic model of poverty alleviation? Now it becomes their fault if they fail, as opposed to giving them basic welfare, which is what they would have needed in the first place in order to be able to pursue other opportunities. Also, there's a whole debate about, are women really in control of their loans? If the household situation is so patriarchal, men are just going to take those loans, appropriate them for their own use, but then women are saddled with payment obligations after. This is a big debate. But again, some people will say it has worked. You have some evidence to suggest that there is increase in income. Some people will say no, they don't end up thinking about rights. They just end up thinking about their businesses. And, there's no space to have a conversation about rights. So it's a back and forth debate. This is a lot more extensive than what I have given you, but I don't want to burn all our time on that. Other debates, we've talked about women-only spaces already. The question of, do men have a place in the movement? I think so. Some women, maybe not as optimistic. What is the correct place of a male ally? What do you think of he for she feminism, of trying to frame feminist goals in a language that would be more palatable to men, maybe, to say things to them like, she's your mother, she's your sister, that's why you shouldn't rape. Do you have a mother, do you have a daughter? Which some feminists will say kind of just reinforces the idea that you need status in order to be worthy, that some women are respectable if you're a mother, but if you're not, then if you're a sex worker, is it okay to commit violence against you? Or why must women's identity and value stem from their relationships to men? Can't we just say she's a person? But then some people are like, and it also reinforces the idea of men as protectors, which is problematic in other ways, because it then suggests that women are vulnerable and in need of protection, which then justifies all of these restrictions on our speech and our mobility, because we're fragile flowers that need protection. But then some people will be like, yes, that's true, but at the same time, it works. If you tell a man that it could be your mother or your daughter, that will make him stop. So how you message these things. It's similar to the role of straight people in LGBT struggles. How much platform do we give straight allies? I think the rule of thumb is they shouldn't be defining the agenda. They should be willing to give up some of their privilege, all of that. The thing with men is, well, they have political power, so maybe they need to be engaged, because we need their power because they have more credibility. So this whole like, should feminists work with religious institutions and religious leaders to mainstream certain messages? What do you lose and what do you gain? So that's a usual conversation in debates, right? Like, what do you gain? Maybe if credible religious leaders are starting to speak publicly against domestic violence and rape and child marriage, maybe you reduce some of those harms. But at the same time, you have legitimized the position of these religious leaders. Further, you have suggested that they are authorities on feminism, and there are some battles they will never back you on. They will continue to oppose abortion. They will continue to oppose sex outside marriage. They will continue to oppose non-heteronormative relationships. So maybe by opening space for yourself, some space for yourself in other fronts, you are for closing doors on other fronts and making those other battles harder. But then again, how would you advance on some fronts if you do exist on such a conservative society? Maybe it's a tactical consideration. Maybe you can change the minds of these religious leaders by working with them closely. Maybe you can operate with a combined strategy of working with them when they agree with you and then bashing them when they don't agree with you, if you can pull that off. It's a very complicated debate. Other common debates, I think this is the last slide, is how radical should our approaches be versus more socially acceptable or reformist ones. So things like protest, slut walk, topless protests, more shocking approaches versus like, oh no, let's work through legislation, advocacy, but not be very radical. Should women advocate for the destruction of the traditional family? Absolutely. But some people will say, no, that is quite threatening. Should women, encourage other women to not have children? Some people will say, yes, because unless people start recognizing the importance of motherhood, we shouldn't, perform this free labor for them. Whereas the other side will say, no, you are just shaming mothers. That's unfair. They need to be supported. And also, some women genuinely want to become mothers. So how radical, how socially acceptable? Do you highlight, for the LGBT movement, do you highlight your difference or your similarity from the mainstream? So some people are very unhappy with the emphasis on same-sex marriage in LGBT advocacy, because they're like, this emphasis on same-sex marriage is kind of like a suggestion that, you can be just like the straight people. We can be just like you. We can have homes and families just like you. We can have careers and earn a lot of money and contribute to the economy just like you. But what about individuals who have very radically different ways of life, right? That their sexuality centers more around pleasure or alternative relationship arrangements and not the model of the family. What happened to them? So now we are separating the gays from the good gays, the respectable gays, and the bad gays that have been abandoned by the movement. Should we work with the police? I've talked about that already. Commercialization also, like, should movements for sexual rights increasingly work with corporations? So I have spoken a little bit earlier about this corporate feminism, corporate icons, role models, whom I really dislike. But, you find another feminist and they will tell you something else. They will give you a good argument for why we need success stories of corporate women succeeding. And the commercialization of pride parades, for example, all these companies now that are like, oh, we are so LGBT friendly. Our product manager is an LGBT person. We sponsor the pride parade. Some people will say that's a good thing because it increases spaces within these companies for sexual and gender rights. And some people will say this is a form of co-optation because it is only certain types of gays who are accepted. It's still on very narrow terms, right? Like, it's kind of a way, I think, of like laundering their reputations again. That's why you see that pride parades have become a lot less radical now and a lot more like respectable, right? What about people of color, trans individuals who are economically precarious? Aren't they the same people who are fighting for the minimum wage that corporations are trying to quash? Aren't they the same people who lose their jobs in economically precarious situations? Aren't they workers in the gig economy? So who cares if your CEO is gay? Like, intersectionality matters when you have trans individuals who are people of color, also already prone to police violence, already prone to discrimination by landlords and their tenants. And this same corporation with a gay CEO is, oh my God, I'm getting really angry, but the same corporation with a gay CEO is enacting like, policies that really harm their most vulnerable and precarious workers. What good does that do us, right? And as an LGBT movement, where should our loyalties lie? Should it lie with our more elite members, or should it lie with our more vulnerable members? I think it's a very important question. I mean, same thing applies to feminism, no? All right, I will be quiet now and see if you have any questions.
Yeah, aren't there kind of different surges of feminism? So for example, within the suffragette movement, a lot of
Olivia, I think I lost
be just as...
Olivia, I lost you for a while. Do you mind repeating your question?
Yeah, sorry. So there are kind of different surges of feminism, right? So for example, the suffragette movement earlier on, where they were talking about women can just wear long pants and do the same work as men, etc. And then now the modern feminism, where they're focusing more on women should be able to just highlight their feminism, and yeah, basically that. How does that apply to debate? And also, how can you categorize that into different strains?
Yeah, so the other story that we use to tell the women's movement stories, the waves, first wave, second wave, third wave. The reason I did not tell the feminist story that way to you is I think it's a bad story, because there's a lot of focus in those stories on women's movements in the West and the way they played out in the West. But that's not the story of how the women's movement played out globally or played out in non-Western society. So that's why I chose to thematize instead of tell you about the waves, which is how it's usually told. You are correct. The suffragette movement was like, what men have, we want to, and we should have. One thing I'm going to tell you about the suffragette movement is they absolutely failed in terms of pushing for the rights of Black women. A lot of the arguments made in favor of the right to vote were in favor of the right to vote for white women. So that should also remind us of the failings and limitations of our idols, right? But fair enough, they are a product of their time. So we need to, I guess we can also think of women's prioritizations as strategic, and they're not static, right? They change over time, and they change in response to the existing norms. So I think in the context of the suffragettes, to be fair to them, the urgent need at that point was to demonstrate that whatever men can do, women should be allowed to do as well. And that's why you have the thing about pants, right? Now, at some point, you're going to have like movements and shifts, as you have pointed out. And now we have a more pluralistic form of feminism. So to be fair, not everyone is saying now that women should be allowed to wear skirts, should, highlight their femininity. Some feminists are saying that. That is also a reaction to certain movements within feminism that are saying we should be like men, right? So, how Condoleezza Rice or even Hillary Clinton had to adopt like certain strategies that were more masculine in order to be seen as credible. So then the reaction to that is, wait a minute, why do we need to do that? We shouldn't have to do that. Here, we should celebrate our femininity, wear skirts, wear bright colors, and we shouldn't stigmatize or like inferiorize these behaviors. So this whole like, there was a big emphasis on career women and women succeeding in their careers for a while, and then you kind of have a pushback that says, wait, don't forget about the housewives. That is dignified work too. That is valuable work too. By overemphasizing, the superwoman who has a successful career and is also like a somehow, a diva in the kitchen, this is unfair, like to some women. That's not always accessible to them. And also like housewife, being a housewife is perfectly legitimate occupation. So instead of putting them into boxes, I guess what I would say to you is each of this is a reaction to different movements and different priorities. And it's always like trying to counterbalance against an excessive focus on one direction, that then again harms specific groups. And they're like, wait, don't forget about this group of women. So some women might want to wear pants, great, but we don't want women also to feel like you need to be wearing pants in order to be successful. Like, that's dangerous as well, because that then suggests that the more feminine stuff is inferior. So we need to pull that back again a little. And then if ever we hear that, oh no, women cannot wear pants, and again you have to go, no, we push back again and we say that we can. So in a way, it's a reaction to how things are evolving around us. Yeah, but thank you for that question. That's a really important, I think that you helped me emphasize. Anyone else?
Don't be afraid to ask questions.
Yeah, questions are good.
Huh?
I said questions are good.
Well, then if we don't have any other questions, I guess we can also say that we can always you can all send the questions to us and we'll forward them to Sharmila. So if somebody's too shy to ask them perhaps now. I'd like to thank Sharmila for her excellent lecture. I have to say, I listened through all of it myself and it was really interesting. So thank you again for your help, for enlightening us on this topic and for your free time. We appreciate it very, very much. And for everyone else, the recording will be available. God, that's a hard sentence to say.
Oh, we have
there's
a
a question from Adam.
Yeah, sorry, I just thought of something. So we've come across during many debates that when there is a motion about feminism, it is extremely hard to, when you are opposition, to argue against it. Obviously, no one really wants to argue against feminism when you are opposition, but in certain ways, that's what's needed from you because that's the side you have to take. So that would be my question: that how can I win a debate when it's about the motion is about feminism and I'm opposition?
Okay. So Adam, my answer to you is, let's shift what you think is your burden. So remember our definition of feminism, which is a belief that everyone is equal. The most basic definition, right? No one is expecting you to argue against that. There is no motion that is asking you to say everyone should not be equal. Feminism debates are usually not about one side arguing in favor of feminism and another side arguing against feminism. Usually it's a debate about what kind of feminism, right? So no one is you're not expected to go up there and say women should not be equal to men. You're expected to argue using feminist logic that is different to the feminist logic of the other side. So, for example, I'm curious to see what motion are you referring to? Can you give me an example of this motion?
Obviously, there are certain type of motions that are easy. So, for example, when it's about the commercialization of feminism, it's easy on both sides because there are ideas you can defend.
Yeah.
But I'm sorry. Someone just called me. I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry.
No problem.
But there is this. So, for example, I cannot think of right now, but of a certain motion. But I remember that, especially impromptu, we have come across many motions that, for example, were worded in a way that it was extremely hard for us to argue in opposition, because it basically turned out that in one side was for feminism and the other side was not for feminism. And I'm not saying that, and I do agree that it is the way that it should be to argue against. So the clash should be certain types of feminism in a motion like this. But my thought, so my question is that, I'm really sorry, someone's calling me again.
No problem. Okay. Yeah, so I guess it's a bit hard for me to answer this without knowing what exactly the motion was. Because if the motion was, this house rejects feminism, I don't think it should be said, right? If the motion is this house believes that feminists should find a different label, oh, there's a debate there, which is maybe the label feminism is too loaded and has too many negative associations, or might be associated too much with the West, so maybe it's better to use a different label. That's a debate, right? You're still actually arguing feminist strategy here, even if you are rejecting a label. If the debate is this house would emphasize class instead of gender, that there are still feminist bases for this debate, because socialist feminists do believe that they believe that the true freedom for women is going to be achieved when we have a more class equal society. So you're not abandoning feminism by supporting that position, right? So some motions that I'm guessing here, some motions that might be worded in a way that suggests that we rethink conventional ways of doing feminism may still be feminist motions ultimately, right? So I wouldn't feel that my burden in that situation is to argue against feminism. I would feel that my burden is to argue a certain perspective. Yeah, I'm sorry I can't be more helpful, because in the face of, so I'm struggling to think of a motion that requires like saying that feminism itself is a problem or shouldn't exist.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking too. So I think it is more like not specifically about the motion, rather about the stance a team takes.
Gotcha. Yeah, so maybe in that situation, it is not the most strategic stance to take. Maybe, so the affirmative action debate, some people think there's no opposition to it, right? Like some people are like, how can you argue against allocating a certain number of seats for women? It would be such an anti-feminist position to say that we shouldn't. I too find this debate hard on op, but there is an op, right? So the op is, yep, we concede that women have been historically disadvantaged. We're not going to disagree with that. We think that is slowly changing, and we think there are ways to deal with that don't involve affirmative action. Some of the ways include funding women's candidates. Emily's List, for example, political action groups and lobby groups that really invest in women candidates, or female voters, or voters, for example, making clear to political parties that you need to run female candidates. But what the danger of affirmative action is that it gives the perception that women are weak and need unfair advantages. That is how it will be perceived, whether it's true or not. And in politics, perception is reality. It will be perceived as women needing a free pass in order to succeed at the expense of men. And there will be so much pressure on these women. And if they fail, or if there are any failures in the government, they will be blamed for it. This will backfire. The cost of failure is too high. Also, what kind of women will you end up empowering? You're likely to empower elite women who already have connections to the political establishment, wives or daughters of male politicians who are not necessarily going to vote for pro-women legislation. But then it's worse, because now that legislation would have been rubber stamped by a female-bodied individuals. I mean, individual, you have like Republican women too, right? Like woman does not necessarily mean good for women. It is better that we mobilize from a grassroots level. So there's a lot of things you can say on all. In real life, the evidence seems to suggest that affirmative action works, but there is contest here, because it hasn't been tried in certain places. There's a risk that if we have it in the US, that it would backfire, because in that society there's a strong emphasis on individual freedom and choice, right? And this will be seen as distorting the choice of voters. But that's still a feminist argument that I'm making. It's an argument on strategy, right? So yeah, if you think of this motion, please send it to me. But at the moment, I'm having trouble formulating a very abstract answer. And of course, I'm going to tell you that I don't think I would be capable of arguing against feminism, in the sense that I would have to defend a position that defends inequality.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean,
all right. Thank you, everyone. I also have to run to another meeting. But yeah, if you do have any questions, please send them to Ivan or the organizers, and I'm happy to send through answers to them.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you.
And the recording will be available as said. So
yeah, send me the recording too.
Yeah.
All right. Bye,
Or I'll send
friends.
you the
Take
link, because
care.
we leave it on Zoom, so it's get a link.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Take
Bye.
care.